Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
If you think about the other kinds of church music that was available for churches, you would have had sheet music for traditional choral stuff. And then you would have had the thing that became kind of a substitute for churches who couldn't afford to do, because choral and orchestral music is super expensive. So most churches, especially small churches, couldn't afford it. So what they would do is they would purchase these soundtracks, karaoke before it was popular in the United States, that was otherwise known as special music, where you could sing along to a track. If you think about the differences between those, like you can see how what the Vineyard was doing was, I think, modeling an achievable sound. No one could sound as good as the people who were, like actually producing Pour Out My Heart or something like that. But you could approximate it. Like if you had a small, because it only required 2 or 3, 4 people to create a doable version of something that people could really like imitate. And I think that was pretty revolutionary. And so creating the soundtrack of it so people would know like, oh, we could clap to this, we could cheer to this, we could, people always talk about the quote unquote worship takeover. I think a lot of it was practical in the sense that this is stuff you can actually do in church. Right. And it's not this kind of unachievable thing. I mean, I would argue, of course, there's a huge difference between the pros and the normies. But, like I grew up in a very small church with no professional musicians, no one who even came close to that. But we could do Pour Out My Heart and really get into it, and we did.
I bet you did.
Oh, yeah, we did.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. Today's episode is hosted by Vineyard USA's Associate National Director of Theology and Education, Caleb Maskell, who will be talking with Dr. Leah Payne about worship culture. Leah is an author and associate professor of American Religious History at Portland Seminary. Let's listen in.
My good friend Leah Payne, it is so great to have you on the We Are Vineyard podcast. Thanks for being here.
Oh, I can't believe I'm talking with the Dr. Caleb Maskell here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's so great. For folks who don't know, you're a historian. You teach American Religious History at Portland Seminary, which is in Portland, Oregon. And you've written a fascinating new book called God Gave Rock and Roll to You, which is a history of contemporary Christian music, published by no less than Oxford University Press. Kind of a big deal. Shout out to Theo Calderara. First time he's ever been talked about on a Vineyard podcast, I have no doubt.
Thank you, Theo. Amazing editor, by the way. Just loved working with him.
Great editor, yes. And great taste in music, as it turns out.
He does,
and you're also, besides being a historian and an author, you're also a lifelong, what would we say, like participant observer in the fascinating world of Christian music and Christian worship. You talk...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
In the book, you talk about how your dad was a pastor. Pentecostal pastor. He was pretty convinced that most CCM music sucked because he remembered how good Larry Norman was and Love Song was, right?
That's like a really good summary. Yeah,
that's
my
about
dad.
It.
Yeah, that was my dad. My dad, it's funny, my dad is so offline, and I've been talking about him for months now about how much he didn't like contemporary Christian music, anything from Amy Grant on. But he loved Jesus music. And I feel like your listeners know exactly the distinction that I'm making right there. So yeah, lots of Larry Norman, Keith Green, Second Chapter of Acts, Daniel Amos, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah.
Well, I've wondered, and we can talk about this, how much California has to do with all that, because Amy is not a Californian, and I think the California scene is kind of different. But there is so much to talk about. So I'm sure our conversation will be freewheeling today, but I'd love for us to focus on the history, on the phenomenon of contemporary worship music, which of course has been just a gigantic part of the story of the Vineyard. And just as we kind of get into it, I have a couple of observations I'd want to raise from your book as I reread it. So the first thing I noticed is, there's a pretty complicated relationship between the thing called contemporary Christian music, CCM, and contemporary worship. And I'd love to talk about that, because it seems like they have some similar points of origin in certain ways, and then they diverge a bit. And then eventually in a way, contemporary worship sort of overwhelms CCM. And I'd love to hear you talk about that. But the other thing I noticed, and of course, this is the We Are Vineyard podcast, is that the Vineyard movement has all kinds of connection to both the CCM story and the contemporary worship story. More CCM at the beginning with people like Larry Norman, Keith Green, Love Song, and all that. And then like a lot more in contemporary worship that starts to develop. Of course, you know, we've got the kind of the John Wimber stream, Mercy Vineyard music, the Canadian invasion that happens before the British invasion, which of course comes. And then Kevin Prosh, so on in there. And then we're even in that kind of weird crossover artists phenomenon. Super successful ones, of course, like Bob Dylan. You know,
heard of him. Yeah.
Heard of him. Yeah, he's pretty good. It's actually his 83rd birthday today.
I don't know.
He's 83 today. Happy birthday, Bob.
Happy birthday, brother. Okay. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
And then other kind of lower key innovator types like Violet Burning, shout out Mike Pritzel, Prayer Chain, a little band called Mumford and Sons.
Heard of them too.
It'd be fun to keep track of all that stuff as well. So I put a ton of stuff on the table just so folks know where we're going. But let's start with a simple, probably complex question. Where does contemporary worship begin? Tell us some stories.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, I think contemporary worship really begins in like, what is contemporary worship? I think it's a form of American revivalism, like at its core. So I would say that like all the elements that go into praise and worship as we know it, you have to understand like the idea, and it's not just in the United States, but the idea that the types of Christians who enjoy and practice this thing called revival, where you get all together and you have this moment, it's stirring music is key. And there are certain kind of rituals that we do together, including things like an altar call and, you know, like a kind of a certain flow of music. And in the book, I talk about the early Pentecostal revivals of the early 20th century on the West Coast. The West Coast, if there's a story, kind of a geographical story, it's the interplay between the American South and the West Coast. And they kind of, I think in the United States, at least, it's a global story for sure. And I try to keep track of all the global strands. But I think in the United States, there's this constant back and forth between the West Coast. So these revival meetings that start on the West Coast, and then a few decades after those early Pentecostal revivals, you have a set of revival meetings that end up creating or hosting this arts collective, for lack of a better word, of, I call them hippieized Christians. And a guy named Larry Eskridge has written a really excellent book about a group of people called the Jesus People and the Jesus Movement. But really what they're doing is a lot like what previous generations of people have done, which is gather together, sing and create beautiful music, have these mystical and really emotionally charged experiences that are for the people who are involved in them, they report them as transformative, like their lives are different after they have this experience with music. So it's a bunch of talented young people creating music that they liked and music for their peers. And there were other places that were creating this thing we call Jesus music. So I list a bunch of, you know, and all over the world, really. But the energy of it was really in California on the West Coast. And these people just create this music that some of them branch off and become professional artists and entertainers. And that is the kind of the foundations of what we would call contemporary Christian music. In fact, the label contemporary Christian comes out of the Jesus movement, out of a group of people that young journalists who are writing about what's happening during the Jesus movement. And then others, though, stay in churches and they continue, like, there's this huge explosion of bands that were creating cool, in my mind, cool Jesus music. My parents were Jesus people. And so, of course, I love that music so much.
Right.
I guess you could have two reactions. Some people hate it. Some people love it. I love it. So some of them went off and became artists and entertainers. Others stayed in the churches and created like the best, most extravagant praise music they could as I think most of them, it was an offering, you know, to God. And they created this really robust scene, this arts scene. And they also kind of held on to this idea that you should continue to engage the young. So a lot of the same churches who were creating like rock music that was meant for liturgical use. Of course, the Vineyard is one of the biggest, most important generators of that.
Mm-hmm.
But they also had this idea, like, we should keep the young people involved. So they would do things like, you know, have a church basement that they turned into a youth room with like a band, you know? So they were cultivating, like, adults were making music for praise and worship, but then also their kids were making music, and they created their own networks of support, and they created albums that they sold really well in churches that were like them. Like you grew up in you and I have very similar charismatic backgrounds. Like I remember, you know, when a new Vineyard album would come out, it was like a deal because we were excited about what kind of, I grew up in the Portland area on the West Coast, but you know, you grew up, like you kind of came of age in Vineyard circles. Do you remember that being like a deal?
Well, I remember, I mean, so I came to faith like pretty at the end of high school. My parents had been house church charismatics in England. And then I had a whole kind of season of not really knowing which end was up in terms of my existential situation.
Right.
But I had like kind of what you were describing, like an encounter with God in a worship context at a boarding school that I was going to when I was 17. And that was my introduction to Vineyard music. And I remember going to a church conference and discovering that there was all this stuff. So I picked up like 3 or 4 tapes, like The Fire Again. That was the era of all that stuff. Changed by Your Glory from the Langley Vineyard. Shout out Canadian Invasion.
Love it. Don't sleep on the Canadians. They really did. They produced a lot of great music, including Jesus music, like Mervyn Merla Watson, Jehovah Jireh. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh my gosh.
I could go on. Yeah.
Yes, maybe we should. But the thing I was aware of was that each of those like albums like brought something like new to my life. So yeah, it was a deal because it was like arts, or music, but it was also a deal because like I encountered God in it.
Right.
I remember like being a teenager and I was into real music. Like I've always loved really good music, you know, being kind of a muso and go deep in all that stuff. So I knew what good music was. But then I got this music and I was like, I like the sounds, but there's also something that happens to me when I hear it. It's like you're in a triangle where it's like God and you and this music that you're interacting with, you know? It's powerful.
Yeah. You know, it's somebody, there's a historian that I cite in the book, Lester Ruth, and Sui Hong. They do some really cool work on tracing the emergence of the praise and worship music, actually, in Canada, through kind of different circles, but I would say like overlapping circles with the Vineyard, Latter Rain movement, that kind of stuff. But one of the things that Lester talks about, and I try to show, is that this music is, I think in most Pentecostal and charismatic circles, music is a sacrament in the sense that like it's where people experience the grace of God in the kind of real traditional definition of the sacrament. And they experience it and they exchange it, you know, like the relationship between the worship leader and the people. I mean, it's hard to overstate like what a profound experience that is for people. So I think, it's funny to think about those little tapes and eventually then CDs. They were so precious because they were like a portable version of that experience. And I mean, for me, I think the Vineyard always had, and I think you were probably the person, because thank you, Doctor, for reading early versions of a lot of my stuff. But,
it was my pleasure.
Oh, it was so helpful. But you know, I think you were the one who pointed out to me the idea that Vineyard really emphasized the congregation and not necessarily like the celebrity worship pastor, which really puts that like the life of the congregation in high relief, right? Like it's not necessarily like, oh, this rock star. It's this idea of what happened there at that church, you know, like I want to go. So did you ever go, I got to ask, did you go, because there was sort of like a worship tourism industry at that time
right.
where people would kind of like go to different places. Did you go to any of the big ones?
No, I never got to do any of that. But I do remember talking, I think, to Casey Coram, who's a kind of a Vineyard Music OG. And Casey, who's actually also the producer of this podcast. Hi, Casey.
Hi, Casey.
He was the one who told me that in the early years of the development of Mercy Vineyard Music, there were sort of iterations of production. So, John Wimber was connected to Calvary Chapel and also to Maranatha. And of course, he himself was a producer of music. He produced the Righteous Brothers and a handful of other folks. So he's like a real musician.
Right.
And he had awareness of what good music on record sounded like, right? So the early years of Vineyard music were, on the one hand, you have songs being written essentially in small group context, songs like Isn't He or Spirit Song, Isn't He Beautiful, or the Spirit songs, Jesus, Oh Jesus, Come and Fill Your Lambs. And you can still even hear the kind of jazzy production of those, like definitely not songs that could be written on guitar, more they're piano songs with bigger arrangements in the ears of the writer.
Yeah.
But so you have that, the small group type worship. And then you have these environments where in studio, they're getting recorded kind of like that Jesus music, the artsy side of the Jesus music that you were describing.
Right.
So maybe on the one hand, there's this thought of, should this be what becomes CCM, right?
Yeah.
Studio, high quality, really amazing, in that sort of second chapter of Acts way, where you're like, wow, how did they do that?
That stuff holds up too.
Oh, it
Highly
does.
recommend revisiting. Yeah.
It really does. Or should we be trying to replicate that space of encounter that began in the small group and then translated over to the church? I think the Vineyard music ultimately chose the latter, which was let's try to capture what God is doing and the sound of this space when God is moving among the people in the context of worship. And part of the way they telegraphed that was they started to include the sounds of the audience, or the sounds of the room, the singers, the clapping, the kind of an ambient room mic, which now sounds really passé, but in the day was kind of an innovation. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Especially if you think about the other kinds of church music that was available for churches. So you would have had sheet music for traditional choral stuff. And then you would have had the thing that became kind of a substitute for churches who couldn't afford to do, because choral and orchestral music is super expensive. So most churches, especially small churches, couldn't afford it. So what they would do is they would purchase these soundtracks, like karaoke before it was popular in the United States. That was otherwise known as special music, where you could sing along to a track. I mean, that is, if you think about the differences between those, like you can see how what the Vineyard was doing was, I think, modeling an achievable sound. No one could sound as good as the people who were, like actually producing Pour Out My Heart or something like that. But you could approximate it. Like if you had a small, because it only required 2 or 3, 4 people to create like a doable version of something that people could really like imitate. And I think that was pretty revolutionary. And so creating the soundtrack of it, so people would know like, oh, we could clap to this, we could cheer to this, we could, I think that was, people always talk about the quote unquote worship takeover. I think a lot of it was like practical in the sense that this is stuff you can actually do, in church. Right. And it's not this kind of unachievable thing. I mean, I would argue, of course, there's a huge difference between the pros and the normies. But, like I grew up in a very small church with no professional musicians, no one who even came close to that. But we could do Pour Out My Heart and really get into it, and we did.
I bet you did.
Oh,
well,
we did.
I'm really struck by what you said. This is something you said earlier about these are folks who are creating spaces for creativity.
Yes.
And so if people have watched the Jesus Revolution, you sort of see that coming together, or even the webinar, the webcast that I did with Chuck Girard and Ken and Joni Gullickson, Cindy
awesome.
Rethmeyer, these others, where what they were doing was creating beautiful music, but they were doing it in the context of churches. So honestly, the kids could come along behind them and give it a try. And what happens over time, I think, is that you have generations of creativity that's kind of encouraged by the parents in the context of church, right?
Yeah. And I think of it as like inheriting a longer, I think of the early Pentecostal traditions where they were doing, and holiness movement, where they're doing things like tarrying. So they would just kind of wait for the Lord and sing and pray and kind of make like actual liturgical space for kind of an unpredictable creative moment. And the denominations, the pre-existing denominations that got a huge influx of Jesus people were Pentecostals, most of them. And then the newer denominations kind of were outgrowth, largely an outgrowth of those types of organizations. And it just continued, like, one of the things that I shouldn't have been surprised at all, but the vast majority of the kind of the bigger bands of the 90s up and through the early 2000s, as you mentioned, almost all of them are in some way related to those movements. A lot of them are children of Jesus people. Yeah. And that's I think it's kind of neat to think about how like this sort of like a remembered practice, like your body kind of knows how to do it because since you've been a very small child, you've just been surrounded by this kind of multi-generational effort to praise God in definitely very extravagant ways that it wouldn't be like, people don't ordinarily think that because for whatever reason, a lot of those churches chose really ugly worship spaces. They're like, we're going to do a warehouse, but they created gorgeous, extravagant music, like that was where the kind of like, we're just gonna anything and everything we're going to put in there. Yeah. So anyway, I like to think of it like that.
Oh, no, it's super interesting to think about the way. And I mean, nobody but Christians does this stuff at 9:00 in the morning either, right? Which is, I lead worship in my church where my wife's the pastor and just at 7:30 when you're dragging your crap through the door once again to do the thing.
It's hardcore.
It trains you to actually be able to deliver something whether you feel like it or not. And that's the same thing that professional musicians have to learn how to do.
Yeah, right? That's true.
It honestly, without lionizing it kind of puts a bit of grit in you where you're like, well, if I can do this at 7:30, I'm not doing it for the glory. I'm doing it because I think it's worth doing. Right. And there's something about that I think is probably very generationally important as well.
And if you think like there's such a weird kind of secular telling of mainstream music, but if you dig at all into any of the top selling pop acts, an overwhelming majority of them grew up in some kind of environment where they were doing churchy type, music. And that just shapes like everything about like, how you engage in the practices and then like the kind of the aesthetic, like the kind of songwriting that you write and all of that stuff. I think because it's weird. I think a lot of the contemporary Christian music world contributed to a more secular imagination around what mainstream music is because they thought it seemed non-Christian or whatever. But if you actually look at the people who were creating it, they were still to this day, most of them have some sort of engagement with that because the music, especially in charismatic and Pentecostal communities, that is pop music in the United States, most of it. And abroad, I think it's like it is fundamentally charismatic or Pentecostal music that we're repeating over and over again.
Well, I'd love to come back to that in just a minute because I want to talk about sort of the way that CCM became a thing in the 80s and then by the 90s it was contemporary worship. And, I remember the 80s being a time of contemporary Christian music being quite popular and me thinking, most of this music I don't like. I mean, I go back to it and I give lots of props to Amy Grant now because she's actually kind of amazing. But a lot of what was being pushed towards me in the churches I was going to, and this may have also been because I didn't really love a lot of what was going on, but I just wasn't into it. But then there was this kind of alternative West Coast thing that was more connected to the worship world I discovered that I was more into. But before we go to that, let's talk about something you said earlier when you're talking about Lester's work. And of course, Lester Ruth wrote a book called Worshiping with the Anaheim Vineyard, The Emergence of Contemporary Worship. And Lester's done quite a bit with us at different Vineyard Scholars events over the years. Love him. But he talks about this phenomenon of real presence, the presence of God in the context of the worship. That's, as long as I've been in the Vineyard, that's pretty much the primary way that I've heard worship described, not as a means to an end. It's not a vehicle for delivering the presence of God. It's a place where the means and the ends are kind of the same. In that you do this, you enter into song, simple song, truthful song, non-performative in the manner of, I don't know, like a rock show in a certain sense. But what you're actually doing is you're entering into a place where the people that you're with, or even possibly, I suppose, on your own, you recognize a third party. You recognize the presence of God in the room with the music. So, I mean, that's a historic spirituality, right? I mean, that tacks all the way into the history of the earliest church. You know, the Roman Catholic Church has a very robust account of sacraments and sacramentality. Obviously, the Orthodox Church, the same. The Evangelical Church historically has not, especially the 19th and 20th century American Evangelical Church. The real presence of God was almost, to some minds, like, well, that's a Catholic thing, right?
Or almost like superstition.
Like almost
going on.
Or potentially dangerous because it might lead to paying attention to something more perhaps than the scripture, or the old joke about Wheaton College that it might lead to dancing. So but like, talk to me a little bit about that. The experience of contemporary worship is an experience of the real presence of God in a way that I think matters. What do you think about that?
I think that's 100% true. And you can see it, especially in the content of Vineyard music, if the lyrical content I'm thinking of. And to me, this is number one indicator that it's an outgrowth of the Jesus movement, because so much of Vineyard music, especially the earlier stuff, emphasizes intimacy with God. Like the very like models about like Jesus as your friend, and the kind of mystical idea of Christ as the bridegroom, the church as the bride. It's intimate. It's very close. And that, I think, is sort of proof of what you're talking about. Like that this is a very close encounter. Like Christians are experiencing, or at least they report experiencing in these moments, union with God, like a really ecstatic moment. And there's a lot of conversation out there. Like I talked about Vineyard as the original Jesus is my boyfriend music. And when I've said that, I joke about it because I actually grew up loving that stuff. And I don't think of that as an insult. I realized later that people do think of that because there's a kind of Reformed tradition that denigrates the mystical union, especially in like people like Mark Driscoll and stuff. And so I realized later that people thought that was an insult. I'm like, what are you talking about? If you look at the medieval tradition, this is like right down the, target,
and totally.
So to me, later Vineyard, such a pioneering movement in terms of how they do it, and the kind of the market that they helped establish in churches for this style of praise and worship. Other traditions tweaked it, especially lyrically, and kind of adapted the music to make it less about a intimacy in a smaller context, and then more adaptable lyrically as well to a megachurch, a stadium sound. So they change the message a little bit. So you can almost obscure the sacramentality of it, I think. But the Vineyard, and I just want to see what you think about this. To me, I'm like, yeah, the Vineyard, you can tell that that's what they're practicing based on how they're singing about, what is the believer's relationship to Christ. It's mystical union, I think, a lot of the music.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly true. We're this summer at our national conferences, we're doing an evening session on the Wednesday evening called A Story of the Vineyard in Song. And
cool.
Yeah, you would love it. You can come. You're very invited.
I could be honorary. I would love to.
You totally are. But we've done a bunch of interviews with people asking about what happened in some of the early days and what are the different themes and the ways these things have shot through our whole story, not just like at the beginning. But Cindy Rethmeyer, who was one of the original Vineyard worship leaders in the Anaheim church, she talks about hearing the song Isn't He for the first time in the context of a small group.
Wow.
And singing it and discovering all the things that you're describing, this kind of really a sense of mystical union, not only with God, but then also in relationship to the people with whom you're also confessing this thing. You're singing this thing that you believe. It binds you together in a certain kind of way as well. It creates the conditions of Christian community, right?
Yeah.
And it reminds me of St. Augustine's idea that community is formed by common objects of love, right? We form community by loving a thing together. And this is what's happening, according to Cindy, in that worship setting. But then she actually also said, and that translated into the wider church setting. Now, when she says wider church setting, she's thinking of a room of max maybe 500.
Right.
It's a different thing if you're talking about the scale of a stadium maybe. And yet, on the other hand, I think of events like, World Youth Day in the Roman Catholic Church. And my guess is that the celebration of the Eucharist in that setting is incredibly powerful. Yeah. And I would also parenthetically recall that once Bob Dylan played World Youth Day, so the whole thing comes in a circle.
Full circle,
whole thing comes in a circle. But there is something about the real presence that lends itself to that intimacy. I would also say, charting the course of what we've done in the Vineyard over the last, it was 50 years this year, is where we began in worship is not necessarily where we've always been able to stay. And that's not a story of decline. That's a story of what do we need to be singing? Because as goes the songs, so goes the movement. I mean, I think that's true. It's almost like a maxim in church history that you can tell that God is moving because so many new songs are getting born. And the way that the music develops will tell you a lot about the way that the movement is going to develop. So there were times in the history of the Vineyard where John Wimber became aware, for example, in the sort of late 80s, that there really wasn't a very robust Christology among Vineyard pastors. There was not a consistent understanding of who Jesus was and specifically what was the nature of the cross. And so one of his responses to that was to ask worship leaders, please write songs about the cross, because he knew nobody goes home whistling the sermon, right?
That is a fact.
But people sure do go home whistling the songs. And so that's how we end up with songs like At the Cross by one of the Butler brothers, or there's a song by Brian Dirksen that has this antiphon at the end of it, mercy triumphs over judgment, only the blood of Jesus. I think it's called Only the Blood. But these wonderful songs about the cross that just kind of entered the bloodstream of the Vineyard because it was a pastoral need. So you see how that might work? Sometimes what you need is intimacy, and then out of intimacy maybe flows the other stuff.
That's really interesting. Yeah, if there's one kind of what I hope to have shown is that if you want to understand the contours of evangelicalism and the trajectory of evangelicalism generally, you see everything happen first in the music. So, for example, Southern Baptists on paper did not like premillennial dispensationalism at all. but they snagged these really catchy tunes from holiness people, from Baptists, from Pentecostals. And then pretty soon, give it a few decades, pretty soon it's consensus, really. And it had to do with the fact that they were picking these ideas up through the music that they sang.
That's right.
And it's weird how this just has historians are typically trained to look at movements like this. It's like they're typically trained to do kind of intellectual history. So it's like, what's the idea? And then idea to idea, great thinker to great thinker. And they don't think of lyricists as being a part of those thinkers, And so then it's like they miss a hugely formative part of what is creating like Christian consensus around theology.
Totally.
And one of the things I think that, Billy Graham understood very well, the power of music. Wimber understood. Somebody who really understood was John Piper. And but I think he was mistaken in terms of, I think he thought that you could make music subject to teaching, and it didn't totally work for him. But I think
it's a give and take. It's
right?
A give and take.
But he knew, and he could not stand those West Coast loosey goosey hippy dippy vineyard people, because they were creating this music that was like cuts right to your heart. And I think most vineyard people would say there was truth there, but it undermined his very strict boundaries around the kind of Reformed doctrine he wanted to present as gospel. Yeah. And they were like the charismatics, I think, are so funny. Not just because I grew up, but they were a constant thorn in the side of people who mistakenly thought that you could like preach a sermon and then people would be like, oh, intellectually, I understand this idea.
Right.
You can try that, but really once someone sings a different idea, you're toast.
We're taking a moment today to share about Vineyard USA's Day of Giving, coming up on Sunday, August 4th, 2024. We're calling this day Seed and Soil, celebrating 50 years of the Vineyard, and taking this day to celebrate and recognize the story that God's written in this movement over our 50-year history as we invest in His story through the Vineyard for generations to come. This Day of Giving is not just another fundraising event. It's a unique opportunity to be a part of something bigger. Your financial partnership enables us to grow our transformative work in our churches and communities. Imagine the ripple effect of more churches being planted, more lives being transformed, and more hearts being touched by the love of Jesus. It's a moment to invest in how we embody the kingdom in the life of our churches, locally and for our movement, both nationally and globally. So join us in celebrating and supporting Vineyard USA on August 4th, 2024. Visit us at vineyardusa.org/generosity to learn more and make your donation. Together, we can advance the kingdom and bring about the change we wish to see in the world. Thank you for being a part of this incredible movement. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Well, this will be a great pivot into sort of what's happened in worship in the last 20 years. But just before we go there, I would say fair play to Piper. Piper's, I think, as an interesting character. Yeah. And you notice that in your book because he did... he has some charismatic background of his own, and he did come around the Vineyard a bit to say, hey, I am having analogous experiences to the ones that you guys are having, but I can't quite sort out how it should fit together theologically because he had this very, as you say, Reformed theological conviction. I think for a while he wondered if it might be possible to see the two integrated. It's just so hard to take the time. I've noticed in ministry settings, things feel very urgent. They feel very important, and it's difficult to take the time that it would take to actually see a kind of integration and the give and take, not the kind of superimposing theology from the top. And so I think Piper was trying. Is my point?
Oh, for sure. And you can see because he has an unusually friendly relationship to the charismatics on the one hand.
Well, it messes with you when you have charismatic experience. What are you supposed to do?
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
So anyway, it's so fascinating. Let's talk about this odd phenomenon that I think so many people who lived through it were not only aware of it, but kind of stunned by it, where worship music went from being this kind of almost like secret that you have. I listen to these tapes, like, young Caleb is listening to like 9 Inch Nails and like second wave ska and Light the Fire Again.
Right? That's so sweet.
And, and all these different kind of these musical mashups, but it doesn't fit, except that it fits because of your experience with God. All of a sudden, that odd arena of music becomes like massive mainstream. It essentially replaces CCM as a genre. So talk about that. Even starting with a bit of that British invasion stuff that you write about in your book.
Okay. This was such a fun thing to think about for a really long time because it is so complex. Really, I think because there's two things happening at once. Worship is ascending and contemporary Christian music is descending. So there's a bunch of reasons why contemporary Christian music descended. And some of CCM's descent corresponds to worship's ascent. But worship music, I'll start with just a funny conversation I had with Dr. Tanya Riches, who is a brilliant historian of Australian Pentecostalism and especially knows a ton about Hillsong.
Yeah.
And was one of my first kind of conversation partners. And I remember asking her, was like, when did Hillsong really break? And she said, in the 2010s. And I was like, what? No way, because I remember in 1995 singing Shout to the Lord at the top of my lungs, And she said, well, that's because you grew up in a charismatic church. So for decades, everything that you just said, there was this thriving transnational worship community that was, I think most of the mechanisms of the business of it came out of the charismatic revivals in the United States and in England and Canada, some other places. And so there were these pretty profitable businesses that were related to denominations and other kind of big churches and that were creating musics by and for charismatics. And it could be like a big one when I was a kid was Rejoice Africa that was recorded in South Africa. And I remember when we got it, we were singing the songs from that. So the people are just like trading songs back and forth. And it's a pretty, like the music very rarely charted on the CCM charts because they weren't manufactured and distributed through kind of mainstream ways, like you said. And also they kind of had a steady stream of sales. They didn't peak the way, because they didn't have marketing teams like regular mainstream albums would have.
And I guess there was no radio at the time too, right?
Yeah, they weren't much on the radio. It's everything that you said. They're kind of underground in that way.
Yeah.
But one of the they were joined, like they had big conferences and denominational gatherings and stuff. So that was a great way to get the word out. But one of the funniest reasons why they didn't appear on the charts and on Christian radio was because, and I talked to a Christian radio promoter, and I was like, why did it take till the 2010s for worship music to really and he goes, well, it would have been a lot sooner. But the thing is, we could not get these Pentecostal and charismatic people to record a 4-minute song. We would only do...
Sorry, this is going to take 14 minutes. Yeah.
Exactly. He's like, we would tell him, I was like, what took Bethel so long? He's like, oh gosh, they turn in these 12-minute, things. Yeah. And with a, tongues praise break or whatever.
Totally.
And so what happened is that there were these groups, I talk about it as a kind of British invasion, these British revivalists who create inspired by kind of stadium experiences in revival. And also Queen, which is an awesome combination. They create sort of a proof of concept, like that you could create British mod rock sounds and combine that with worship lyrics, and it would be very, very popular. Delirious is the most well-known group, but they weren't the only ones. And then I read in the book about how Nashville, which became the real financial hub and media hub of contemporary Christian music, they kind of Americanized that pretty quickly with a group called Sonic Flood.
Mm-hmm.
That has a Vineyard connection by way of the Brownsville revival. They're all connected. And so these kind of essentially modern rock sounds really take off. And I think the group that does maybe the most to kind of Americanize it and homogenize it is the Passion movement, because they Southern baptize it.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they kind of they adopt, they do all these things, they're affiliated acts. Like the Crowder, I think, did maybe the most to introduce charismatic music to Southern Baptist audiences, because he covered a lot of charismatic stuff, like How He Loves, and he kind of cleans up the language so it's not so mystical and sensual. And he creates these they're professional, they're polished. They don't have the kind of wildness and the loose ends that are I think core to most charismatic experiences.
Totally.
And it made it to where a Southern Baptist kid, it wouldn't feel super weird to be worshiping in this style. So they kind of introduce charismatic light to these college networks. And from there, it's just sky's the limit, because
it just takes off.
Yeah. And I have often wondered what the Vineyard type worship folks thought of that as it was happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I'm sure that lots of folks listening will have lots of thoughts about this, because really the time you're describing, the mid-90s, was a time of incredible significance for the Vineyard at the time, and then also now. It was significant because John Wimber was sick and dying. So there was sort of a sense of, oh man, what have we done and been through? It was significant because the Toronto Blessing was happening, which I was very much connected to. And so many people
my dad visited.
Yeah, many people of my generation who are now in leadership were deeply affected by that. Wow. And it was also a time where not only were we experiencing renewed spiritual power, but we were in our late teens and early 20s, and it was possible to go buy a guitar and have a band. You weren't a kid. You were someone with time on their hands who could try some stuff. And of course, it was also a time when a lot of church planting was happening. Church planting as a phenomenon, as opposed to just affiliation of your pre-existing church with, say, the Vineyard movement. In the 90s, church planting becomes a much more robust thing and stays that way for, a good decade. And so you have all these young leaders with guitars listening to folks like Kevin Prosh. Right. And I mean, Kevin, has had all kinds of trouble in his life. But if you listen to the people you're just naming, Martin Smith, Matt Redman, and the folks who are in the charismatic world, they would all point to Kevin as he's the guy who taught us how to lead worship in this 14-minute song type of way. And so there was a way in which that kind of music, I mean, not to be tribal about it, but it felt like our music. This is what we do. And then just to watch that get transmuted into a Nashville. I mean, I remember seeing Delirious in 1996 in a warehouse in England, and they were called the Cutting Edge Band, and they were just about to become the band Delirious. And it was wildly cool. It was super, super interesting. Jam-packed warehouse. It was like a rave, basically. And the music was something else, because Martin Smith sure can write a song.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
But then a year later, or 2 years later, it's being repressed by some Nashville company, and I'm already uh-oh. It's you can hear the bell tolling. This does not feel cool.
R.I.P.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's funny. One of the major points that I try to make in the book is this is how the market shapes Christianity in the United States. This is how market forces. And if you look at contemporary Christian music as a business, and eventually the worship music business, and I want to make a distinction between the act of Christian worship and then the industry of worship music. There's, some people wouldn't even make the distinction, but once you start to sell this stuff, it tends to do the things that markets do, which is consolidate, homogenize, like cannibalize, like all these kinds of things that any other market would do, like in any other kind of industry. And that can be very disorienting, I think, for people who are not expecting it to happen. And I think, a lot of the stuff like I remember, it's funny that you say this. I haven't had this memory in a long time, but I remember when Passion was coming out, and I remember it felt like and not like at the same time. On the one hand, it was like, okay, all the right instruments are up there, and you kind of have the, generically handsome guy who's got his guitar. And I'm like, okay, I know that. Check and check.
Well, and for a minute, it was Matt Redman.
Yeah. Well, I remember his music. It's funny that you say that because I have this weird memory of, because at that time, a lot of the Piper emphasis on the on providence and on the power of God and the greatness of God and all of that was like, how great is our God? Those were kind of like the big songs. But I remember hearing Matt Redman's song, Salvation Spring Up from the Ground. And I was like, oh, now, okay, I get that.
Now we're back.
Yeah, we're back in action. And I, I didn't think anything of it I was just a young adult at the time. But then when I went back through and I was going through like the Passion roster and their kind of network, I'm like, oh, he really sticks out because he's got a charismatic mind, like that kind of like visceral imagination is. It's not like it's not an either or for most people, I think, but it's distinct from the emphasis on the kind of supremacy of Christ that's really popular in neo-reform circles. So that was just my own experience with it.
No, I think it was very, very acute, and it would Sonic Flood. They're doing all these Vineyard songs. Shout out to Andy Park and The Secret.
Absolutely.
And then of course Passion. But then now, Leah, in a way, talk about like the charismatic mind. Hillsong, I think a lot of Hillsong songs have a real theological richness to them. Some folks would sort of point at them and say, well, they're kind of more in the kind of word faith vein at times. I think for my money, a lot of their songs are very, very theologically astute. And then you have the Bethel songs, which do tend to skew more Pentecostal, more word faith, and kind of in a way, I don't want to say this critically, but it's like if you look at the songs of the 80s, most of the songs of the 80s and 90s take most of their metaphors from scripture. If you fast forward to the last 10 years, many of the metaphors feel like not necessarily anti-scriptural or anti-theological, but they feel like they're drawing on more of a kind of pop and or emotional mentality. I feel like old grandpa complaining. I'm not, I promise. I'm just trying to find a way of talking about the moment that we're in, because as I experience church leadership right now, I'm aware that I want our worship to be re-catechizing Christians who've had a ton of emotional experience, probably learning to lead worship now from YouTube. And they think that worship is meant to look and feel and sound like whatever YouTube version of the new Bethel or Hillsong tune. But they haven't necessarily had that sort of depth of theological attunement that would have come from their past, or even that sense of intimacy and that sort of small group, isn't he thing. I don't know. I'm fumbling towards talking about something. Do you know what I'm talking about? And what do you want to say about it?
Gosh, I mean, it's so... I actually, while you were talking, I like Googled the top CCLI top 100. Matt Redman, I think, is in there a couple times. Phil Wickham, Chris Tomlin, some of the usual suspects. I'll say that kind of the two probably top worship houses right now, if I had to name two, would be Elevation and Maverick City. Yeah. And I think that they are building on I think of Vineyard as kind of two generations back now. Because there's Vineyard, and then you have Hillsong and Bethel, and now we have like Elevation, and there are lots of other things in between there. But in terms of just kind
those
of
the big ones.
Passion, I should say. I'm sorry. So it's like Vineyard, Passion, and Passion, sort of like the Texas Baptist thing, and then Bethel's like the wild West Coast, and Hillsong's like the AG Australian. Anyway, so So there's like these houses, the kind of the it houses right now. I think they emphasize, in the book I talk about how they really emphasize the triumphant Christian life and the prosperous Christian life. And, you can find biblical, of course, you can make biblical cases for that stuff. But I think that emphasis sounds a little different coming from a well-to-do, well-heeled congregation than it does from, a storefront church. And so some of the music in the kind of lyrical content that they are appropriating comes from like, it sounds a little different when it's a very wealthy, like glamorous, glitzy congregation, because I hear like people are very, very eager to criticize the prosperity gospel and many times for good reason. But I do think it matters who's saying it. Like
Totally.
If you are from a oppressed and impoverished group and you're talking about like triumph in Jesus, it sounds a little different than if you're like from a really wealthy, like, look at how great things are going for me. This is the work of God in my life. So I don't know if I'd say like, I definitely think they're different theological lessons from a lot of these. And I don't know, to me, the thing that's really distinct about where we're at now is the decreasing relationship to institutions. So
Interesting.
Vineyard music is vineyard, right? It's of the vineyard and accountable to the vineyard and in whatever kind of like its relationship with vineyard. And then Elevation recently disaffiliated from the Southern Baptist Convention. They were Southern Baptist in name only because like that's the most Pentecostal Southern Baptist church I've ever seen. So they are now not affiliated. Maverick City has no church. And so they're sort of, in my mind, they kind of represent the market consensus. Like they represent Christian theology according to the marketplace.
Wow.
Because like people buy the ideas that they think are reflective of like the Christian life, and they buy a lot of Maverick City and a lot of Elevation.
Interesting.
And they also go to these like massive, CCM, they don't do stadium tours like they used to. Worship music, what? They are having like, you can pay almost $200 to go worship. Just to let you know, Caleb, I'm sure they're coming through your...
Oh, I look forward to that.
Well, for $145 or whatever, you can go see your favorite worship.
I mean, that is just wild. And I mean, I do want to say for clarity, I love some Mav City and I love some Elevation songs. Do It Again was my anthem as I finished my PhD. But,
are you kidding? Oh, I love that.
I know. It's super helpful to me.
I love their music. Like, it's incredible.
What you're saying is, I think it's really true. There's a kind of tetheredness and a kind of accountability to a community that we need in Vineyard. At least we need Vineyard music to be able to attend to what are the things happening in Vineyard, what's growing up from the ground, and also what are the ways we need to be led and steering, even if that doesn't connect to some even if market research would suggest that we should write a song about winning, if we're actually losing, we should sing a song about losing, because then we're telling the truth and our bias towards reality will be honored by God.
Can I say like one small story that illustrates your point?
Yeah.
Which is one of the people, and I include them in the book. She talks about growing up in kind of the white middle class communities that really fueled CCM. And she talked about how when she became a young adult, it was very unsatisfying to her because it didn't reflect the kind of realities of human existence. And she found her roommate in college introduced her to Black gospel music. And she found in the Black gospel tradition a much broader experience with God, including a robust account for human suffering and like the faithfulness of God and even the triumph of God, even in suffering. And to me, that is it was a great moment because it illustrates like what people think that they want is good for them and what they'll buy a lot. Sometimes it's not really like, it doesn't encompass the entirety of the Christian tradition. And it also can set people up for a real feeling of disillusionment because it only, represents like when you said, if we're losing and then we have all these songs, like there's no songs of lament. Like,
right.
And I just looked through the CCLI thing. I see no song that has anything to do with what the Bible has a robust account of, which is like horrifying human suffering,
Yeah.
but then like the presence of God in that suffering. So
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think we
Well,
need this
yeah.
song.
And I mean, there's a way in which some of that reflects our current political moment too. And, I think, we've seen in certain ways the politicization of certain kinds of worship. I think of like Sean Foyt and that these guys are sort of taking politics on the road and using God and the worship of God as what can feel like sort of the handmaiden of politics.
Oh boy, yeah.
And it strikes me that what we need in this moment is exactly the opposite. Because, I mean, Scripture is very, very clear that kings rise and fall, and politics is not something that you bet your life on any more than riches is something that you bet your life on. But in fact, the reverse would be the case where, the stability that comes from knowing who God is, who you are, and I would say specifically also who the people of God are, right? I mean, the songs are not individual songs. They're group songs. They're songs of a community of people who hopefully in season and out of season, if they're living biblically, are going to find their way to a kind of stable witness no matter what's happening in the world. Do you think that contemporary worship has what it takes to meet the moment?
Oh, okay. This is what I'll say. Wow, that's like a heavy question. I'll say that one of the things that I hope people take away from this is that this type of music is very powerful. That power can be used in a variety of different ways. Like one example I use is the song Waymaker by Sinach, who wrote this like incredible song. It is, I think, a really great example of the transnational nature of worship music. So she's a Nigerian artist, kind of a huge superstar, writes this song. It gets picked up by a group of oneness Pentecostals, interestingly enough. And then apparently Michael W. Smith's daughter sees it, sends it to her dad. He records it. Anyway, this song was used at anti-vax rallies and anti-social distancing rallies, and also Black Lives Matter rallies.
How about that?
As any social movement will benefit from a powerfully written song. And so Waymaker was of use to both of those communities. So I think that there's absolutely power there. And people like Sean Foyt, who is not an accomplished songwriter or singer. In fact, most of the songs that he sings, he did not write. And prior to his political career, he was a volunteer pastor, a worship pastor at Bethel. So he wasn't on their professional roster, is what I'm saying. I think his real talents are this kind of political opportunity that he has taken hold of. So Foyt understands, what I'm saying is like, Foyt understands that worship music is very powerful. And he also understands the legacy of Jesus people, by the way, because he uses their psychedelic styles and he makes direct callbacks. And he's received a lot of support from people like Greg Laurie, who were most Vineyard people who've been around for a while will know who he is at least. And so he is saying, this is a power, I'm going to tap into it. He happens to be a pretty far right-wing activist, but there's no reason why this music can't be used in other ways. So I think it has been politically mobilized by somebody like Foyt, but that doesn't need to be its only like deployment. And I think Waymaker is a great example of that. So, and most importantly, I think Waymaker has been a hugely like encouraging song for the global church, especially during the pandemic. I think it was a very helpful song for people when they were feeling, especially I've talked to a lot of church leaders where they're feeling really out of sorts. I mean, what a difficult time to be a pastor in so many ways. But anyway, so yeah, I guess the thing is, it's like super powerful, and it's up to us, I think, how to wield that power. And I keep coming back to Billy Graham because he was so moved by music as a young man and always like he was a major proponent of CCM, even though he didn't really like, I think, probably most of the music he platformed, because he understood like it got people and it like mobilized them. But so have any important social movement in the United States, like especially the civil rights movement. I mean, they're incredible. There's a whole catalog of music that energized that movement. So I feel like it's powerful, and it's sort of up to church communities and church leaders to figure out, like, how will you deploy that power?
Yeah. So the last word is a discernment word. Pay attention to powerful tools that you have in your hands, because they can be used by God and by you for great good. But if you kind of move towards the commodification of everything, you can find yourself with weird outcomes that you would never have hoped for.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, a lot of people who are in the business mistakenly thought that they were controlling it. And they thought that they were bringing like the gospel to people, Christian teachings to people on their terms. But once you put it in the marketplace, you lose a lot of control over what you're doing. And I think a lot of people, in fact, I got a really nice and poignant email from someone who was industry executive for a long time. And he emailed me and said, what did I give my life to? Like, what was I doing? Was it all a mistake?
Yeah.
And I responded, in some ways I can't answer that question, but I responded like, oh, it was complicated, right? Like there were lots of things, great things happened, not great things happened.
Right.
But I think he was a great example of someone who was like very optimistic about what he could accomplish for God in a marketing culture and in the American marketplace. And a lot of things happened that he wasn't anticipating along the way.
Totally. Yes. Okay. So the last question, I know you got to go, but the last question, if just talking to pastors and leaders listening to this, there's going to be a ton of people who are involved in worship in their churches week in and week out. People like me. I think I'm playing Waymaker at the kids service on Sunday.
It's a great one.
Get ready.
I challenge anyone not to go away singing it after you've heard it once. Just sing it again forever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so in light of all the big stuff that we've been talking about, I mean, what's a pastoral word? What do you think, as a seminary prof and someone who's a close observer? I know historians love to say we don't do that, but I mean, what would you want to say to a pastor who's saying, I want to faithfully pastor people in a worship world, and I've been deeply formed by all this stuff? What should they be paying attention to?
Wow. I'll put that hat on. I'm going to just first identify as a pastor's kid and just say that I have like a lot of compassion for people who are involved in church ministry, because I've seen the burden of it and the responsibility. And I don't say burden like in a necessarily bad way, but it's just heavy. It's hard work. It's hard work. Yeah. And so I just first want to say how much I appreciate the difficulties and the complexities, especially now. I think probably everybody says that, but I think now pastors are really facing especially in the next few months, I would guess. In the United States in particular, it's going to be a very charged time. But this is just me speaking. I think there's one good and pure and true thing, and that's the person of Jesus as a Christian. And so that's who I encourage. I mean, love God, love God and love your neighbor. I have no profound things to give people that are not just like kind of fundamental Christian things. And also, though, I think like if the history of the Vineyard is any teacher, you can't go wrong by following the gentle presence of the Holy Spirit. I think, I'm not a Vineyard person, but it's sort of like a cousin tradition, and I feel like one of the things, like the best of the Vineyard, is attending to the Spirit as a comforter and like the gentle presence of the Holy Spirit. Those are like so countercultural now in our day and age. And I think if there's anything that we need now, like the public witness of the Vineyard, there's so much beauty in that. But I'm not a Vineyard person, so
You're very humble, Leah. You don't want to tell us what to do.
Now. I'm like, I don't want to tell you what to do.
Don't panic. You're very humble, and I know you don't want to tell us what to do, but you may well have just given us something like the word of the Lord. So thank you, Leah. I appreciate you so much. This was really great.
I love all my brothers and sisters in the Vineyard. Thank you for your work.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.